Hello and welcome back to Searching for Reality. And we are here now with our last module, Module 13, on postmodernism and the construction of gender. So what I'd like to do is start with the first part here and ask ourselves, what is modernity? And more importantly, what is it in relation to postmodernity? So we should actually start with perhaps a definition of what comes first, which is modernity. And the modern period or modernity is usually from about the 17th century to the 19th century. It's roughly about a 300-year period. And it's marked by a change in beliefs and attitudes. And really it comes into being because of science, because of the rise of the individual, and a whole range of things. But we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. So if modernity ends in the middle of the 19th century, the modern era is believed to have ended around the end of the Second World War, around 1945. And from that point on, depending on where you're looking, and whether you're looking at social formations or economics or politics or certainly culture, it is more or less after the Second World War. And depending, again, where you look, it can start as late as the mid-50s. But again, let's go back and see if we can define what modernity is, or the spirit of modernity. First of all, it's definitely a break with medieval thought. We think about the power that the church had as an institution, as a social institution, but it also was a political institution and mostly a cultural one as well. And so through pushback from philosophy and science and the arts, eventually the church kind of gets moved off to one side, and secular thought and science begins to take that center stage. And so we have a real flourishing of intellectual and scientific and human activities to define this new era that comes after medieval thought and starting around, like I say, the 1600s. So depending, again, where you look in politics, we have Machiavelli writing The Prince and talking about political realism, the reality of political structures. We looked at the social contracts with Thomas Hobbes writing in the mid-1600s, John Locke in the very tail end of the 1600s, Rousseau writing at the very tail end of the 1700s. That's a 100-year period right there. And from these ideas, the idea of the social contract and liberal democracy, come the ideas and the institutions associated with democracy and with republicanism. And republicanism is a kind of structure, it's a political institution that is based on the rule of law rather than some kind of sacred or theological foundation. So it's focusing more on the law. So that's a republic. The U.S. is a republic. France is a republic. And so we have that in terms of politics. In science, we have a sort of renewed view of the empirical view of the world through science. And we have Galileo, Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, Copernicus, a whole range of people doing a variety of things in different fields, such as psychology, astronomy, sociology, economics. Economics was not even a thing back then. It really came into being in the 1700s, but most definitely the 1800s. Arts and culture, again, another area that is not completely separate, because the substructure, which is the means of production and the relations of production, workers and capitalism, that is the base substructure. And the superstructure, which is arts and culture, and politics and science, philosophy, education, all of these various aspects of society begin to interact with one another and are influenced by one another. But in arts and culture, we have an increasing amount of secularization, in other words, movement away from theology, a very strong focus on the individual. And that's a very much a Western European thing. So the rise of the individual as somehow as the seat of reason. No longer do we have to look to the pulpit or the throne to dictate our daily existence and reasons for living. The individual can now figure this out. There is also, and this is something that becomes important in postmodernism, is the inevitability of progress. The fact that progress is simply just a natural occurrence. Things will always get better. scientifically, politically, economically, of course, put all that in quotations. And then ultimately the idea, the possibility, but certainly the idea that the world could be understood rationally. It could be understood using science. Okay, so we have some of the early thinkers. We've already talked about Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. We've talked about Immanuel Kant, and he writes a short essay called What is Enlightenment? And he writes in 1784 something that really kind of captures the spirit of the times, or what the Germans would call the zeitgeist, right? It means literally that, the spirit of the times. And Kant writes, Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. And that immaturity is a lack of daring, a lack of reaching out, a lack of going beyond what is easy, right? So this immaturity was self-imposed. We just didn't think we could do it. And if it's caused not in the lack of understanding, but in the indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. So there's that rise of the individual in the most clearest stated way. The fact that we really lack the courage. Now, let's be honest here. The church was a powerful entity. So it may not have been a matter of us not having courage. It was also self-preservation, because Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake for trying to have the courage to speak on his own. So let's keep that in context. So during the medieval times, discourse, dissent, disagreement, opposition, alternative ideas were sadly lacking, simply because those who came up with those were often killed as a result, because they dared to know. More importantly, they dared to speak. So yes, Kant does encapsulate enlightenment, but let's remember, let's keep this very important quote in a specific context. That indecision and lack of courage, yes, by this point, it is, first of all, safer to speak out loud about such issues. There are scientifically based or culturally based or based on some sort of secular principle. All these things are important, but they always do occur in a context which we need to be mindful of. Now, the focus on rationality and reason becomes really important. We talked briefly about the Scottish Enlightenment. We talked about David Hume. We talked about Adam Smith. There was also Francis Hutcheson, Adam Ferguson, Thomas Reid. There was a range of Scottish Enlightenment philosophers who were moralists. Some became economists, such as Adam Smith. He combined, in fact, those two things, moral philosophy and economics, and came up with, of course, the Wealth of Nations that we talk about, or did speak about a few weeks ago. So the father, we'll say, of modern economics, Adam Smith, again, believed that the individual had the capacity to make the right decisions. There was a belief and a trust in the individual to know what to do, because we had a moral compass. We had moral guidance that we had internalized over the period of our life, to then turn around in adulthood, decide to choose the right path. And so prior to that, it was more sort of a centralized focus on the church and or at the same time the king. But there was always a central sort of deferral to what to do next. And Adam Smith says, look, the whole notion of a free economy is free individuals who know what to do. Now, again, let's not kid ourselves. Smith also writes in The Wealth of Nations that there is always that very real possibility of people acting immorally. And because he was a moralist and believed in moral philosophy, he injected that into his modern economics and said, look, we know what to do. We have the rationality and we have the reason, but let's not lose our moral compass at the same time. So this is a focus on the individual in a very, very strong way. So a quote from Wealth of Nations: it is not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. The notion that there is a kind of reciprocity, right, between the buyer and the seller, that as much as the seller wishes to make a profit, the other individual is looking to buy something. They may or may not be able to actually build or create or bring into being the thing that they need. So they go to the butcher or the baker, whoever, and purchase the thing that they need, that they cannot create on their own. And so the two really are brought together through that invisible hand, and both are satisfied in some way. Because remember, the buyer still is working somewhere else making money, and they too wish to be able to get, the best bang for the buck, we'll say. But these two people come together and mutually are beneficial to one another. So individual freedom is part of this modern view of economics, because again, economics in itself is brand new. So what Adam Smith is talking about here and stresses is this notion of a free market, right? The free market, economic competition in an open marketplace. It benefits all, benefits the buyer and the seller, and it comes out sort of with a degree of reciprocity. Now, once again, let's keep in mind that as much as Smith talked about the morality of individuals that are conducting business in the marketplace, he also said that the only way that a free market can work effectively and truly is without government intervention. So this is something that rarely happens, because what is occurring now quite often, especially in developed nations, is that lobby groups pressure the government into either ruling in their favor, which may also rule out competition, which now makes it less of a free market. But Smith was really careful to stress that the only way that a market is truly free is if it exists and is brought into being under no government intervention or interference. But that's rarely happened. So as much as it sounds like a free market is a good idea, we need to remember exactly what that looked like. So, thing here. Okay. So we talked about the focus on the individual, the ability of the individual to be reasonable and rational. We also talk about the expansion, right? The growth and development of democratic institutions. The fact that we now have property owning individuals. It isn't just a lord or a king or some member of the aristocracy. Regular folks, right? Regular folks can buy property. That was something very new. That was another characteristic of modernity. The fact that people could purchase property, something that just didn't happen before. So there was really at the core of this, the rise of the individual and human freedom, subjective human freedom. And this notion that it wasn't a bad thing, that society would flourish, the free market would flourish, economics and political structures would flourish, and that human freedom was not dangerous, not something that we should be fearful of, or we should lock people up for having opposing ideas. So the notion of human freedom, the notion of human rationality, human reason, was enough to allow these institutions to come into being and to flourish and to develop and to become what we know today. So prior to that, there was feudalism, where there was little to no property ownership by anyone other than members of the aristocracy. And it took a long time for that to shift from an agrarian economy, a feudal economy, to early forms of industrialization. And so as this is happening, it changes everything. Industrialization changes everything. And social formations come into being. Others will die away. Obviously, serfdom and feudalism die away with the introduction of industrialization. If people aren't happy with the Lord, hey, see you later. And off they go somewhere else to find work. So again, human freedom, human movement, human rationality, all focused on the individual being able to do the right thing. Now, at the same time, there were individuals that, of course, had a vested interest in keeping things the way they were, and there were sort of counter-Enlightenment thinkers. And you can take a look at them here in this link. It's worth knowing, because it sounds like this is something that was agreed to by everybody. It never is. There's always going to be pushback. And typically the kind of pushback that we saw against the Enlightenment and these kinds of ideas about human freedom were by those that really were fearful that human beings might make a mistake. Now, their ideas were based on the degree of bloodshed during the French Revolution. And let's face it, the possibility of those individuals, especially if they're affiliated with the aristocracy, of being overthrown, if not outright killed. So political events were changing some individuals' ideas about the degree to which human freedom should be allowed, right? We need to make sure that we know our place, right? We know how far we can extend this degree of freedom. But certainly by the late 1700s in France, the notion of human freedom was so powerful that it actually overthrew a monarchy. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were beheaded. The aristocracy was defeated and destroyed. Many of those people were beheaded. And something brand new was put in its place, which is a republic, right? The French Republic. And of course, as this is going on as well, we have the same thing happening in America. So the American Revolution and the French Revolution overlap to a great degree. It was in the air, right? People were simply thinking this way. So we've just finished talking about modernism, lasting roughly 300 years from about 1640 to 1940. And it is predicated on this break with medieval thinking, medieval attitudes, medieval beliefs, medieval structures. And the result in this period of modernity or modernism is the list we see here. The beginnings of the human sciences focus on things that we now call the social contract theories, a focus on the individual, right? Independent thinking and political freedom. The notion of human rights, right? The Bill of Rights is written in the late 1700s in America. The Bill of Rights is also the Rights of Man, is also a document that it comes into existence after the French Revolution. So the entrenching of human rights becomes something very, very important. Now in Canada, we don't have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms till the early 1980s, but that's not to say that we were trampling on human rights. We just didn't have a document we could refer to. The way Americans keep referring to the Constitution, we now have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The idea to have something like that goes as far back as the 17 and 1800s. So quite a remarkable idea that still, has credence. So along with that, there is a movement away from the power of the church. There's an increased amount of secularization. In other words, the belief that theology is just simply one component of a person's life, is not the central focus of one's very existence, and more important, the existence of society. Because the secularization, right, the fact that things become more secular, is part of this pushback against the church. Along with the human sciences, is the fact that the world could be, hopefully, rationally understood. And that natural laws would come into being, and these are the laws that we talked about with the social contract theory, but also the fact that the world can be rationally understood through science, right? Through science, through empirical evidence. And finally, that economic competition, again, in a free and open marketplace, would benefit everyone. But a truly free market, as described by Smith in his The Wealth of Nations, didn't exist for very long, because governments were asked to intervene at various times to stop rampant profiteering and so on. So yeah, free market is more a theory than it is or was an actual living thing. Okay, so that was modernity. And so let's take a look at postmodernity here. So we have Enlightenment modernism from the 17th and 18th century. There is this notion of economic and social progress, the notion that history always moves forward and moves to a better and better place, greater amounts of freedom, if you're a believer in Hegel, the notion that history moves with a goal, with a purpose. It moves inexorably. And so each time, the degree of intellectual and economic development is greater and greater. And no matter which philosopher you wanted to align yourself with at the time, the notion of historical progress was exactly that. It was looked at positively, that history rarely kind of made a massive detour and started going backwards. Generally not, although I would say the last 4 years in the US is an indication that, yeah, history doesn't move in a straight line. Kind of zigs and zags a little bit, but hopefully we're going to be zigging very soon and going back towards greater amounts of freedom. Okay, so we're talking about here social and economic progress. or the notion that history moves forward to greater and greater things. And the notion that in the future is this kind of world, this hopefully not utopian world, but a world where things will be better, right? And advances in technology, in knowledge, human relationships, all these things are just going to get better and better. So there will always be more advances rather than less. And ultimately, this whole idea of this kind of inevitable progress, and again, another link right here, you can take a look at what that is. The notion that history had a direction was part of this sort of idea that the world can be understood rationally. History was just not a series of random events. Once historians look carefully at causal effects, or making sure that to see what were the conditions prior to something happening, why did things develop in the way that they did? And so once we look at that, we can start to believe that perhaps, history does have a purpose and does have a goal in mind. So that's modernity. Well, along comes postmodernity and sort of kind of begins to wonder, like, it's kind of, historical progress. Are you sure? Are you sure history has a direction? Are you sure human rationality is increasing? Because given what's going on, it sounds like things are going quite the opposite direction. And so in the same ways we had critiques of the Enlightenment in terms of degrees of human freedom, we have the same sort of ideas about what eventually becomes postmodernity. And so late modernity, the world that we are now looking at, created by science and political structures and economic structures, the various apparatus, right, of the modern state, the belief now, some individuals, Nietzsche for sure, actually thought that the modern state did repress individuals, not free them. Remember that wonderful line that I read to you from from the Gay Science, said that society is really little more than a slow suicide. It's pretty strong stuff. So there are individuals that look at the modern state as constricting and restricting human freedom. It represses individuals. It doesn't free them. And not only that, but science was in fact creating an increasingly irrational world. As we are working in a particular company, modern technology creates devices that throw us out of work. And we're still facing that. Soon we're going to be facing an influx of jobs that are going to be replaced, or we will be replaced by robots, by AIs. And the belief is within the next 20 years, something like 50 million jobs will be gone and replaced by AIs. Now, imagine we've just gone through. We're about to finish a pandemic, hopefully. Something like a pandemic is ideal for people that are looking to replace us with robots. Robots don't get sick. Robots don't complain. Robots don't ask for overtime. It is ideal. So these are the kinds of ideas that critiques of modernity and certainly postmodern thinkers are deeply concerned with, because that's not a positive, progressive view of history. It's in fact an increasingly regressive and limiting view of the future. If we allow rationality to run rampant, we may be permanently thrown out of work, and we will live in a society that produces millions of consumer products, but no money to buy it, right? There'll be no money to buy these products because no one's working. So we have to be very careful when we talk about historical progress. We need to define exactly what that is. And yes, for every AI that's invented, medicine, for example, scientists in the medical field come up with a cure for disease. So it's not all bad, but we need to be very careful, and we start being more relative, right? We look at things in relative ways. So the worst case scenario was the Second World War. It was bad enough that the First World War decimated Western Europe. But within, 15, 20 years, another war. How is that rational? How is that historically good? So world wars, technology, the atomic bomb, all these things now allow science to enable us to be able to kill each other even more effectively. So is that something we should be proud of? Not really. because it doesn't really help anyone. It just means that if we blow things up, the likelihood of splitting the earth in half is probably even greater. Not much of an accomplishment. So there are limits to what the Enlightenment was asking us to do. We think back to Kant, right? Dare to think, dare to speak. Well, people were daring to do all kinds of things, and the end result is all kinds of rather terrifying scenarios of not utopias, but dystopias. And so the limits of Enlightenment, meant the limits of human life, and the fact that there could be in a very real sense, another global war. And this one, with the kind of gear that we've got, we will blow ourselves up forever. There will be nothing left. So many of the post-World War II thinkers, or more importantly, those that went through the Second World War in particular, were deeply troubled by this increasing rationality of science, of politics and economics. Theodor Adorno, for example, a very famous writer, writes in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, look at the date, 1944, the same year as the end of the Second World War. He writes, Enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters, right? There's the individual at the center of the universe. Yet, the wholly enlightened earth radiates under the sign of disaster triumphant. So, the notion all we have managed to accomplish in our human freedom is better and better ways to kill each other. Another one of my favorite lines from Prisms, cultural criticism finds itself faced with the final stage of the dialectic of culture and barbarism. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And this is a very famous line from a cultural criticism in society, where Adorno says, at the point we're at, how dare we sit and reflect and think and talk about art when we're literally living on top of a powder keg. So we need to really think carefully about what we consider to be good and bad about this notion of historical progress. Now, many of the postmodern thinkers come from Western Europe and really came into being after the Second World War for exactly that reason. They lived through a war. You and I never have, and I hope you and I never have to. But I think it deeply and fundamentally changes everything you think. You either embrace religion like no one else, or you reject it. You either embrace science or you utterly reject it. And so no one sort of stood in the middle and really didn't know. You made that decision. And so as a result, people really felt strongly about whatever position that they took. And so many of the postmodern thinkers come from this time and this place, Western Europe after the Second World War, after witnessing the kind of horrors and atrocities of concentration camps, atomic bombs, the firebombing of Dresden. These things are not progressive. These things are not things that we should be proud of. And yet here we are doing them. So the end result is that reason has failed to deliver a reasonable world. And again, Adorno, how can the progress of modern science and medicine and industry promise to liberate people from ignorance, disease, and brutal mind-numbing work, yet help create a world where people willingly swallow fascist ideology, knowingly practice deliberate genocide, and energetically develop lethal weapons of mass destruction? Think back to the Trump supporters just over the last few months, but certainly over the last 6 months. They're absolutely fervent desire to use violence to achieve their ends. We're in 2020. We're not in 1740. We're not in the middle of a revolution, or are we? So the way people behave is often not an indication of the fact that we are, in fact, that we are moving forward. We kind of not. We're not. So we have, of course, the beginnings of totalitarianism as we move globally towards the right, more towards right-wing thinking. And Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite philosophers, wrote, this is the book that she wrote in the 1950s, and presents to us in the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, something that we should be really mindful of. Again, this book, believe it or not, is now back on the bestseller list for obvious reasons. Because when we look around, we're wondering, how the hell did we get here? So she says, we can no longer afford to take that which was good in the past and simply call it our heritage. Okay, to discard the bad and simply think of it as a dead load, which by itself time will bury in oblivion. We're not like that anymore. We're not crazy fascists, or are we? The subterranean stream of Western history has finally come to the surface and usurped the dignity of our tradition. That's what's happening in the US. This is the reality in which we live. And she wrote that 70 plus years ago. In fact, almost 80 years ago. And yet it is exactly where we're at. There are ugly, ugly subterranean, streams of hatred and vitriol and racism and just horrible things that are now coming to the surface because every once in a while, political leaders act and talk as if they're condoning that kind of behavior. And this is exactly what we saw in the US have seen for the last 4 years, is basically a green light for people to be virulent racists and sexist and just hate anybody that doesn't think like them or agree with everything that they believe in, as whacked out and conspiratorial as it may be. There we are, right? Those subterranean streams are there. So let's never kid ourselves that Western Europe is the cradle of civilization, because if you are interested in history at all, look it up. It is a site of so many wars, religious wars, territorial wars, world wars. No, it's not the cradle of civilization, not at all. So again, let's not kid ourselves. So as you can see, I'm being postmodern here, right? I'm being highly critical of something that we have believed up to a certain point in time as being correct. And that's kind of what postmodernism does, right? It questions agreed to beliefs. It questions and criticizes things that we have assumed for such a long time to be right, because no one's ever stopped to think about it. So we need to be very careful when we think this way and making assumptions about the way things are, right? We can't just bury things that we disagree with in the past and just go, it's over, and highlight and privilege all the good things. No, both of them have to be taken together. We need to address both. So postmodernity is a range of things, but it is for sure, in terms of this course, that has focused primarily on philosophy. Postmodernism is a critique of the Enlightenment, and certainly in the wake, first of all, in World War II, but most definitely World War I, but most definitely after World War II. And essentially, postmodernity is a set of views about the nature of progress, if it even exists, right? It questions the validity of this statement. The process of social constructions in terms of knowledge and morality. It is very skeptical towards texts. It wishes to deconstruct texts and look at them and say, okay, well, whose interests are being served in this book? Why does this book read the way it does? Why does it privilege this over that? Why not both? And once again, one of the first thinkers to present to us a model of that kind of thinking was Nietzsche. Nietzsche writing The Genealogy of Morals. If you're going to read one book by Nietzsche, I would recommend not reading Beyond Good and Evil or Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but in fact, read The Genealogy of Morals. It's actually just an essay, but it's a fascinating essay that Nietzsche wrote about the beginnings of moral values. And he asks, who benefits from these moral values? Who calls the shots? Whose interests are being served by following this line of thought rather than a different one? And Nietzsche, in 1880 something, when he wrote it, really presents to us the template for postmodern thinking, right? To dig down into the genealogy of something or to deconstruct texts. You could say that Nietzsche was one of the very first postmodern thinkers. Now, it wasn't called that at the time. In fact, he wasn't even a fan of modernity, but his dislike of modernity showed us a way out. And that way out led us to postmodernism, which is something we're still in. So it is a set of philosophical views about the nature of progress, the nature of knowledge and morality, the construction of texts that silence certain voices and privilege others. There's also a change in ideas regarding capitalism after 1945. We have globalization, we have global trade, increasing divisions of labor, and then now we've got automation, which is a whole other issue that was not as bad, say, 100 years ago, but critical now. There are also art movements. There was surrealism and Dadaism and futurism. These are these are isms that were artistic movements that were responding to social, political, and economic conditions and rejecting them. So you've got art movements that are postmodern. You've got architecture, sculpture, painting, literature. And these books are analyzing the world around us in critical ways. They're not praising the world, right? They're calling the world into question, which is something that is really worth doing. And one of the most important thinkers, certainly popular thinkers, was Jean-François Lyotard. And Lyotard, one of his main claims was what he called an incredulity there towards meta-narratives. A disbelief might be an easier way to say it. A disbelief towards meta-narratives. Now, what does that mean? What it means for Lyotard is we no longer believe these grand stories about the way things come into being. The notion of history is progressive. That's a meta-narrative, and we don't buy into it anymore. The fact that political structures are always going to give us and grant us greater and greater degrees of freedom. That's not true. So these meta-narratives that kind of explain away the world, these now we look at with increasing skepticism and increasing disbelief, because we look to see and we look around ourselves and see not quite what we thought was going to be, is it? The idea versus the reality don't quite work out. But certainly the notion of history, this idea, again, presented probably in its finest form with Hegel, his philosophy of history, because he presents to us that history, the end point of history is liberal democracy, the state, and within the state we have the most amount of freedom. But within 40 years of Hegel presenting that, we have Marx that disputes it, we have Nietzsche that disputes that. So we have already thinkers that are setting the stage for postmodern thinking, looking at the world in a more relative way, looking at the world in a more skeptical way. And so what Lyotard does is he points out that we now have a disbelief towards these meta-narratives. And probably the biggest one, the one that influences the most, is this notion of history always moving into these greater and greater stages. We would be almost blind to believe that this is still happening. When we look around and we go, how can the situation we're in right now be a good thing? We're destroying the earth. We're putting kids into cages. We're pardoning criminals, and we're basically crucifying heroes. We're doing the most insane things. How is this good? How is this progressive? It isn't. So if that's the case, this notion of achieving this perfect, stable world, no, it won't, but neither will knowledge about it either. So we're able to look at it and say, the world itself will not be stable forever, is in fact rarely stable. And the knowledge that we have about it is also not stable. So we need to be sort of careful about these meta-narratives that present to us this alternative viewpoint of things kind of working all out at the end. Probably one of the most popular ones is the notion of the hero's quest, that somehow the hero goes out, they have challenges, they may have some helpers along the way, and they triumphantly return and they save the day. And really, the Marvel universe is full of these kinds of heroes, and right now, the jury's out of how things are going to play out, but it is still the notion of a hero that's going to come by. And so this idea, which is allegedly universal, we don't know for sure. We try to fit the other stories into that hero model and hope that parts of it fit, or enough of it fits that it's going to make sense. But this notion of a hero is really kind of a modern idea, because the hero is the individual, right? And that didn't happen until the 17 or 1800s. So it is a kind of metaphorical view of our relationship to these institutions that were around us. And we, over time, have been able to overcome them and reintegrate them into our lives in a more beneficial way. And that certainly was the idea But depending on who you ask, if you ask Nietzsche, said, nope, we're worse off. Remember that slow suicide that's called the state? We got to replace that, right? We need to have purely and completely individual thinking. So this notion that even the hero journey is something that is shared universally, even the idea of universal myths is thrown into question. This idea that somehow we all share the same sort of collective unconscious. We talked about this last week with Freud, and in particular with Jung. This notion that universal myths do exist. This was really what Jung was all about. And postmodern thinkers have essentially thrown that out, saying, no, I don't think there are really that many of them around to say that this is really a consistent thing around the world. Many different variations. And really in the end, what we are doing is imposing our cultural viewpoint on other nations and cherry picking the things that match up. So we say, oh, there's an earlier version of ourselves, and they're on the way. When in fact we should look at them as entities unto themselves. In fact, cultural relativism is exactly that. It's learning how to look at a culture and its behaviors from the inside. And cultural relativism is something that could be considered very postmodern. It does start sort of in anthropology in about the 1930s, 40s, but it does come into being sort of in a much greater way around the 60s and 70s, as this kind of work in sort of developing nations and in the very few areas that can still be studied in a way that anthropologists might have, let's say, 150 years ago. But cultural relativism is an idea that is postmodern because it does not try to place our historical values onto another culture. We look at the culture from their point of view. So these kinds of ideas, the hero myth and so on, Joseph Campbell, who was sort of a very, very popular anthropologist, really kind of wrote, they're fascinating books. They're worth reading. But we need to be careful when he starts making claims about the universality of some of these myths. They're not. We think that they're there, and we like to see certain things in those myths, but we need to look at them as creations from that culture, not us importing them or exporting them. We need to look at them on their own terms. So again, these are all part of these grand myths, right? These meta-narratives. And some people even think that Freud's idea of the id, the id, the ego, and the superego, that too is a meta-narrative. And some people will take it, some will leave it. But either way, it doesn't really matter. We need to just be mindful of the way in which it is a construct for us to understand the world. So, anthropology, just like liberal Democrats believe that human societies would progress and keep on moving. But no, the world moves at different speeds, and it moves at different speeds for very specific reasons. So if you go to Papua New Guinea, or you go to Paris, or you go to New York, or London, Ontario, or Sao Paulo, Brazil, it doesn't matter. People will move at different speeds, and they will develop their thinking at different speeds because they are reflecting their own culture. And so people around the world simply develop at different speeds. And we should not be applying a value judgment to that and somehow think that Western Europe is the pinnacle of thinking. Who's to say that that's as far as they've gone? That's it. It's backwards from this point. And South America will develop, and they will lead the way. Or India, or Southeast Asia. Could be anywhere. So the notion of Western Europe as the cradle of civilization, the end point of history of liberal democracy, that's a meta-narrative that we need to throw out. So this kind of thinking really is representative of postmodern thinking. So it is looking at the world in a relative kind of way, comparatively, and trying not to make value judgments, trying not to rely on these meta-narratives that have been around forever, universal myths, and anything that's universal. When you start talking about those kinds of ideas, you're treading on dangerous territory because we don't know ultimately if they're universal myths. We're making a claim. And we, just like science, make a claim of knowledge we know at the time. But it seems that as we look more carefully, things are quite different. And the notion of universality is something we should put in quotations. Okay, so we talked about postmodernism, and here we're going to take a look at the construction of gender as one aspect of this postmodern world. But now, before we go any further, I just want to kind of set the stage for feminist thinking as a form of postmodern thinking. Now, we're going to just take a look at a couple of thinkers very briefly, but we're going to look sort of more in terms of the construction of gender as it relates to postmodernism. So what I do want to point out, though, is when we speak about feminism, we should speak about it in terms of its waves, because there are different waves that come along and are not in charge, but focus on certain aspects. But the wave that we're in now, we're in the fourth wave. When I went to school in the 90s, when I was studying like women's studies and feminist studies and gender studies, I was kind of in the tail end of the third wave. So when we talk about waves, it kind of looks something like this. Okay, so we have first wave feminism. So we're talking the late 19th century, early 20th century. So we're on the cusp, right? We're just on the cusp of modernity moving into postmodernity. And here there are issues that are concerning politics, primarily politics, economic issues, and for example, the suffragette movement to get women the vote, because at this point women couldn't even vote or even have bank accounts. So simple and clear, straightforward goals that the first wave of feminists were trying to conduct, which was simply to allow women to be able to have a bank account and vote and have a say in what was going on, have some control over their lives. So the second wave, it sort of begins, you can see early 20th century, we can say kind of up to the 40s. And the second wave feminism starts kind of again in the 1960s. Now there's a lot of overlap. So you can see there's almost something like a 20 to 30 year overlap. But second wave feminism starts in the 1960s and it moves into about the early 90s. And here it's a response to the anti-war and the civil rights movements that were very powerful in Western Europe and especially in the US. There was also the self-consciousness movements, minority groups, indigenous groups. There was an awakening. There was an awakening of individuals and looking around and realizing that their lot in life was not very good. And quite often, the political movements that were there would often harness the feminist agenda as well. And so minority groups, if they were trying to overthrow colonialism or assert their rights as indigenous populations, second wave feminism was all part of that. Third wave feminism starts in the mid-90s. This is the time that I was studying, informed by again, post-colonial, because once these minority groups have established themselves, now they need to define who they are. So there's post-colonial and postmodern thinking at the same time. And here we start, again, looking at these issues that become more and more important, not only in postmodernism, but in the fourth wave feminism. And this is the notion of universal womanhood. What is that? What does that look like around the world? How is it identified? Along with that is questions about body and gender, sexuality, and sexual normativity, right? These kinds of ideas now are looking at the status quo and tearing apart the status quo and asking why. Why is this constructed this way? So from the third wave, we get to the fourth wave, and there is some overlap and some similarity. But what happens with the fourth wave is it takes these, I'm not going to say high-minded ideas, but theories, right? We'll call them theories, and it brings them down to the street, right? It takes them out to the street and makes them part of public discourse. We are now going to talk about this through social media, public discourse, in public spaces. And so you have now feminism brought down to sort of to the level of the street where everybody sees it. It isn't just academics talking, at conferences about some kind of theoretical idea and a female poet that was discovered writing in the 1300s. Let's talk about that. There's room for that, but there's also room for movements out in the street and body positivity movements, sexual assault awareness. Essentially what the third wave does is, like I say, it brings it down to the street and really begins asking serious and critical questions about what is femininity, what is gender, what is sexuality, how are these things identified, and are we in fact on the right track? So, to go back once again, very briefly, that historical context for feminism was originally legal and political, because we were talking about the fact that women couldn't vote at this point. So just to have the opportunity to vote was already a chance to participate in public discourse. This was literally something that women did not have the opportunity to do. So through the suffragette movement, there was eventually begrudgingly vote given to women first, I think in England, then in Canada, then in the US, and finally after the Second World War to women living in France. But this is really important because a woman could not be financially independent without the help of a man. And so when we look at that, when we look at the dates, right, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, 1974, right, allowed women to have their own line of credit independently of their husband. And you think, well, seriously? Yeah, 1974. That's how long ago it was. So these kinds of ideas, we think about it now, it's like seriously, that's how bad it was? Yes, it was. So to hold someone down politically and economically in a disenfranchised and disempowered position made it very difficult for women at that time to have their voices heard, to ask for things to change. Now, there's also the notion, and this is a very powerful slogan from the 60s, the personal is political. So personal things that mattered most to women were also of a political nature. What was happening, what was mattering to women were often matters of sexuality. And here's a really good example. Okay, the marital rape exception, which meant that the consent of a husband to have sex with his wife at any time, and even if the wife said no, that was not considered rape. This was simply an issue of property. The husband owned the wife as property, as chattel. And to criminalize marital rape did not occur in Canada until 1982. So it was serious. Imagine saying no to someone that you're married to, but because you are married to them, they have total control over your sexuality, and you can't say no. And you've heard the expression, just say no? Well, back then, there was no such thing. So in the US, rape was specifically defined to exclude wives. A male who has sexual intercourse with a female not his wife is guilty of rape. In other words, a man who's having sexual intercourse with a female who is his wife is not guilty of rape. So these things, 1993, right? It took a little over a quarter of a century, right? That's how long ago that was for that to happen. So it is hard to believe that these are the situations that women were facing, and through pushing and pushing and pushing, they finally were changed. Now, we talked about social and political movements and social and political ideas. I'm going to open this window here because it's getting a little bit dark. The notion that in science as well, we have some changes. So we have now a feminist philosophy of science, where we're looking at models in the human sciences that may have been gendered, this idea of a male universal. And what this means is even when you read a book, and it could be a book written just even, let's say, 30 years ago, when we use the word man, well, of course we're implying women as well, but the word man somehow was there just to stand in for women. Well, in the sciences, that's a model, right? When we use the word man, we're implying men and women. Well, then just say men and women. But it took having to push to make that change. So that's in the philosophy of science. Some of the models that have been used have been very gendered because they are male focused. Female or feminist historians are busy recovering neglected figures from throughout history. And so these individuals did very important work, but were essentially silenced. So feminist historians are looking to find and recover these people. And then finally, feminist economists are looking at the role of unpaid domestic labor, which is an ongoing problem around the world, that domestic labor is just not paid, because the notion is that a woman is doing it, and therefore because a woman does it, that it's not It should not be considered paid labor. It's just taking care of the house. Well, okay, take that out of the equation and not have someone do the housework. How long is it going to be before we run out of clothes? How long is it going to be before we start going hungry because we come home and there's no dinner, right? These things need to be addressed. And that particular one, unpaid domestic labor, is an ongoing issue still. The choices that women have, for example, is also a very important issue in terms of job opportunities, the proverbial glass ceiling, for example, that we keep talking about. Okay, so we're just going to move now in the last part of this module into sex and gender, and Simone de Beauvoir, who's the first sort of feminist philosopher that posits this notion of gender. And she, not surprisingly, was a big fan of Nietzsche and does the same thing in The Second Sex, her very famous book, that Nietzsche did in the Genealogy of Morals, is to present a kind of archaeology, digging down into those differences, why things are the way they are and not some other way. So Beauvoir presents to feminism this remarkable idea, and she posits a difference between biological sex, the physiology of that individual, versus something called gender. And that split is now made for the first time. So there's a distinction between sex and gender. So sex is the biology of a person. Gender is the social construct of that person. So these are the things that are part of postmodernism, because Beauvoir's writing, I think Second Sex came out in 1948. And so this is just on the cusp, right? This is the beginnings of postmodernism. And the notion of a social construction of an individual is something that is very, very important. Because ultimately what it is, right, a social construct is a shared understanding between several individuals that create a social meaning that can be acted upon and provide grounds for organization, knowledge, and morality. So what that means is it is an agreed to understanding that this will mean this. Now, it works in language. Language is an agreed to set of words that at a certain point in time, we all agree that this word means this and that word means something else. But language itself is a social construct. We agree that something will mean something for a period of time. A social construct in terms of the role of women and the construction of femininity works the same way. It's a shared understanding between individuals. These would be individuals in a community. And so the end result is that we now agree that this form of behavior will be designated as male and this other as female. Hold on one sec. I'm going to turn my light on because it's just getting darker and darker here. Okay, so social construct is exactly that. It creates a kind of template for a desired or recognized form of behavior. And so once we do that, we agree that men and women should or ought to act in this way. And we have certainly a hand in forming it, but we don't have as much of a hand at breaking it. But what's happening right now, and has been, I would say, over the last 5 or 6 years, is clear pushback on what a gender construct is. So we say that gender is a social construct, and it is really implying that the differences between what we thought was a typical or expected form of behavior is not always reducible to the biology of the person. In other words, a man can cry in public. A woman could be very strong and could punch someone in the head if they have to. These forms of behavior were traditionally, and again, the word traditionally, always using quotations, especially in this postmodern world. What's happening now is expected forms of behavior or expected behaviors traditionally assigned to male or female is now being used more and more interchangeably. Women are stronger, men are more affective, men are more able to show their emotions, and it's a big deal. And whether you want to call them metrosexual or whatever, it doesn't matter. The notion is now we are living in a climate where men and women can show different sides of themselves to the world without value judgments. Now, we're far from a perfect situation. There's still lots of pushback. Still people go crazy when they see something that doesn't fit this typical criteria of what a man or woman should look like or act like or talk like. We're there. We're on our way. But the most important thing that Beauvoir shows to us is that gender as a social construct is not, it is based on sexuality, but the very thing that makes it up is just not, hold on just one sec. So, not quite sure where I left off. The phone rang, but I'm back. But the idea, finally, that gender is a social construct shows that it is willfully constructed by us. We agree that certain facets of a person's behavior will be associated with their biology. But we know that not all those differences are reducible to biology, because now we know that men can be affective and can show expressions, and women can be very strong and do things which are, again, traditionally considered to be the behavior of men. So when we talk about sex and gender, right, we need to, again, be very careful in terms of the same way that postmodernism sort of takes things apart, looks at them kind of in a dialectical, relative sort of way. We're doing the same thing here with sex and gender, because when we talk about sex, we're talking about biological characteristics. And again, if you want to look at it some more, there's the link. But the notion of sex as biological characteristics, especially having to do with reproduction, that is distinct from gender, which are social roles that we agree to in society that will look a certain way. And this form of behavior is traditionally associated with men or women. But the thing is, nothing is etched in stone. It's not universal. Just like I said with the hero's quest and universal myths, they're essentially, the myth part is right, the universal part not so much. So what's happening here is sex is not such a rigid category. Neither is gender. And this is what I'm trying to get at here, is some of these things we associate are quite arbitrary. Fashion and behavior and a certain look. And it becomes almost qualitative differences, not quantitative. And so what's happening now with sex and gender is we realize that a lot of it is sort of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And if that's the case, they're not rigid binary positions. They are much more flexible. And this is one of the reasons why Beauvoir famously said, one is not born a woman, but rather becomes a woman. So you may be born into the body of a female, but the category, the social category, right? The social construct of woman is something that you end up growing into. You learn to live within that capacity. And so this is a very famous idea of de Beauvoir, that it's not the biology of woman, it is the social construct of woman, the gender construct of woman that is so restrictive. And so if that's the case, this is one of the reasons why Beauvoir was also an existentialist, because with existentialism, existence precedes essence. And so existence, which is the everyday actions of an individual within the confines of this social construct, their essential being is developed out of it. And de Beauvoir was, found that very problematic, because yes, she agreed that existence precedes essence, but at the same time, what if that existence ran counterintuitive to gender roles? What if men really enjoyed wearing skirts and women like to wear pants? It's a fashion statement, but does existence now precede essence? Hey, that man's wearing a skirt. What does that say about him? That woman's wearing pants. What does that say about her? And of course, these are comments that, maybe 50 years ago might have shocked people, but it doesn't shock us anymore. We're slowly getting used to it because we realize that both sex and gender are processes, right? They're not rigid positions, and especially not rigid binary positions. So Beauvoir asks, right, how does one become a woman, right, through these gender constructs? And she does say that those social roles are taught and internalized at a very young age by young girls, and those differences become they kind of collapse in with that essential difference when in fact they shouldn't. So what happens is a cultural difference, right, a cultural construct sort of collapses on top of a biological difference, and one is meant to speak for the other, when in fact they are two separate things. So when we talk about behavior, the kinds of toys that kids play with, the kind of clothes that people play with, the color pink is just designated as female, and there's nothing about it there's no femaleness in the color pink. Girls can like the color blue. Doesn't mean the end of the world. It doesn't. So these kinds of things really now, we're in a social worldview where these kinds of things are finally being discussed in an honest way, and people are beginning to realize that yes, a gender reveal party, is that something you really have to do with your child? It's something that we should allow the child to explore and allow them to choose what they feel most comfortable with. But certainly the social roles at the time Beauvoir was writing were deeply, restricting to women. So there are biological differences, of course, between men and women, and there are more overlaps than we care to admit, because when it comes to brains and minds, there are no male and female characteristics. To be honest, for me, some of the best teachers I've had have been female. What does that say about me? I'm not fearful of intelligent women, not one bit. I embrace the idea of having intelligent women, not because it is counter to what is traditionally the case. I've just found, just as people and as thinkers, I gravitate towards them. So the point is that intelligence is not sex specific. It seems to be gender specific. Remember, because male intellect is supposedly something that exists and is timeless. It's not. It isn't. It's not been. There are just as many intelligent females, but they have been silenced, and that's the difference. Now, when it comes to sex too, that's also not a rigid category. It's not a rigid position. There's a whole range of things in between male and female. So sex, we talk about X and Y chromosomes. There is a small percentage of the population that are born, and they're called intersex children. And those children, again, the fact that consent is not even thought of, surgically they're assigned a gender at birth, and without the parental consent, because when they're born, parents, put it this way, if you've ever experienced birth, the first thing that happens when that baby is born, it gets whisked off into another room. Oh, okay, can I see my child? Oh, hold on, we got to clean him up. And sometimes these are the things they look for. If a child is intersex, there may be the possibility of surgery to correct that. But what that means is, when we talk about male and female, these are just sort of opposite ends. But there are all kinds of other sort of sexes in between, depending on the amount of X and Y chromosomes that a person may have. So the biology underlying sex, it's complicated, but it should not and it cannot be reduced to this kind of binary male-female. There is that, but there is everything in between. So the last thing I want to talk about is Judith Butler, because we did talk about Simone de Beauvoir, and I want to talk a little bit about Judith Butler, who is a more recent philosopher, writing primarily since about the 1990s. And her book, Gender Trouble, talks about and presents a thesis that social construct, right, the social construct of gender, she believes is performative. And what that means is it performs an act. So to speak in a certain way, to stand and talk and walk in a certain way, to dress in a certain way is a performative aspect. So in the same way as and performative comes from language and from speech, because the word is performing an act in its place. So the example here, I promise, that is in fact, it stands in for the act of promising to someone. So Butler looks at this and looks at the notion of performative acts and says that gender is also performative. It may be a social construct, but it is done through performative acts. And so other forms of communication and manner, because when we do this and we are performing, right, whether it is through our clothing, our hairstyle, makeup or lack of makeup, and these things, all that is broadcasting. It is speaking on our behalf. It is telegraphing to the person who is observing us that we are behaving in a certain way. And so that is the kind of that's a thesis that Butler is presenting. Now, to conclude, as you can imagine, there have been some issues that have been raised as a result of this theory, because for one thing, the idea of man and woman are now no longer stable entities, right? They have existed for a long period of time. They themselves are social construct. When you talk about masculine and feminine, that's gender. Man, woman are kind of metaphysical concepts. Girl, boy are physiological concepts. These sort of binary oppositions are not as stable as we thought they were. And this is thanks to Butler's work. But it's something that, as a result, even though they are performative aspects of our behavior and they are telescoping and broadcasting to people who we are or who we would like to be, more importantly, how we would like to be perceived. That's the important part. But even in Butler's book, there's no talk about how society will change the way they treat women. So depending on how a person is behaving, if they are broadcasting the female gender and those ideas associated with the female gender, well, the violence against women is still there. We know, sadly, too many individuals who have been killed in the trans community because of individuals who have been either mortified or terrified or confused or rendered, for some reason, violent towards individuals who are choosing to act in a certain way and are broadcasting that out in public, but misread. So as much as Butler's idea about man and woman not being stable categories and gender not being a stable category, but in fact performative, as she says, it's performing, it's on putting on an act, it still doesn't explain away violence against women or violence even against people perceived to be women. That's the other important thing. So that is something that we need to be very mindful of. So it is at least a tool for us to demystify the trans and intersex issues, something that was considered to be somehow a physiological disability or a mental disability. These categories are now been finally thrown out. Gender identity disorders, gender dysmorphia, body dysmorphia. These categories, which belonged in psychoanalysis, are now being reevaluated and rethought in a much kinder and more inclusive way. And that is at least what we can give Butler thanks for opening that up. But it certainly, at the very least, allows us to look at these categories in a more skeptical way, less likely to take these positions for granted and realize that if they are performative, are open for modification by both sexes at the same time. So that's essentially the end of module 13 here, week 13 on postmodernism, and one of these sort of more difficult aspects of postmodernism. Difficult because it's playing out in real time in front of us, and things do change. Because as soon as Butler's book, for example, was out, there were clear attacks against it. As soon as we think that a book has come out and those that are just sort of on the peripheral and not in the community think, oh, this is a good idea. But let's always keep an open mind on these ideas, because we need to hear from the community whether they agree with what's being discussed on their behalf, because we don't want any more silenced voices. And that if postmodernism is anything, it's having voices that are no longer silenced. Okay, so as I say, that's the end of module 13 on postmodernism and the construction of gender. We will have one more Zoom meeting on Monday, and that'll be it. And the quiz is going to open up. I believe I've got it opening up on Sunday morning, and it'll be open right for the week. But no matter what, we'll talk about it on Monday. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you real soon.